You're listening to The Conversation. It was in early February on Korean television when Kim Hae-soo, the governor of Jindo County, made a startling suggestion about how to tackle the country's shrinking population. Why not import young women from Sri Lanka and Vietnam to have children with Korean bachelors?
During a live-stream town hall, Governor Kim said rural areas are facing what he called an extinction crisis and went on to propose importing women to marry bachelors.
Kim later apologised, but he was instantly suspended from the ruling Democratic Party and his comments widely condemned. It even caused a diplomatic incident with Vietnam. The furore showed the ongoing political preoccupation with low birth rates in South Korea and what that might mean for the future of the population, which it's projected could drop by a third within the next 50 years. Around the world, governments are worried that they'll see similar demographic challenges to South Korea, home to an ageing population and fewer children. But this week, when South Korea released its provisional statistics for births and deaths in 2025, they showed that for the second year running, more people are having children. The 6.8% rise in births is being cautiously celebrated. But does it really signal a turnaround in South Korea's demographic fortunes? I'm Gemma Ware from The Conversation, a news and analysis platform partnering journalists with academics. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly, where experts explain how we ended up here. Today, how South Korea boosted its birth rate and why its population is still shrinking. Stuart Chytil-Baston, you're a professor of social science and public policy at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, where you research demography, ageing and birth rates across the world, particularly in Asia. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly.
Thank you so much.
So Stuart, South Korea has just published data for the number of births and deaths in 2025, and it shows a slight increase in the total fertility rate to 0.8. What was your reaction when you saw this?
I wasn't really surprised because we've seen an increase before. I wasn't surprised how everyone was very excited about this, but 0.8 is still very low, right? It's a bit of a turnaround, but it's still one of, if not the lowest in the world. But I can see how if you're the government of Korea and you are putting an enormous amount of financial and political investment in this over the years, this must feel like a vindication of all of that. Of course, it's not as simple as that. There are other things going on. One or two data points don't necessarily make a trend. We need to understand this for a bit longer. And I don't necessarily think they have found the magic ingredients yet to significantly turn around fertility rates.
A 0.8 fertility rate, tell me what that actually means in real terms.
It basically says that this would be the average number of children that a woman would have if she had all the children that she would ever have in 1 year. So it's a very peculiar thing. But more or less, we could say that this is the average number of children that women in South Korea are having, which is about 0.8. So to put that into context, here in Hong Kong, in Macau, just over the water over there, we're a little bit lower. We're down about 0.7, 0.75. Mainland China is about 1. Japan is up about 1.3, 1.4. Britain is a little bit high, but not very much. It's still kind of 1.4, 1.5. And now the majority of the world's population are living in territories with fertility rates below about 2.1, which is given as what they call the replacement rate. So without migration, this is what a population roughly needs to replace itself.
So South Korea began to take its shrinking population quite seriously in the early 2000s when it entered a period of what's called ultra-low fertility. What had led to that point?
The remarkable thing about South Korea is that for a country with fertility rates above 6 in the 1960s, their fertility rate dropped below 2 in the early 1980s. So in common with many other parts of the world, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, there was a concern in Korea that population growth was holding back economic growth, right? And that by decreasing the fertility rate, this can be a driver towards economic development, not least by putting women into the labour market, having fewer children, diverting resources into kind of economic development and industrial growth. And of course, then they have very significant anti-natalist policies. Don't forget, in the 60s and the 70s, Korea was an authoritarian regime. There was a dictatorship. You did as you were told in many ways, right? So it was a very top-down way of getting things done. And This was done in various different ways through very intensive family planning program with some very strong, almost coercive elements of a very intensive, what you might call propaganda or education, kind of really pushing people and telling people like the country is full. You should have fewer, better children, right? And really emphasizing the difficulties of having children and all of which is, of course, the opposite of what is happening now, right? So that's another big change. And then also having policies in place to very, very strongly encourage people to have fewer children. So you would have tax exemptions, but only for the first 3 children and then only for the first 2 children, or education subsidies only for the first 2 children. Or if you got sterilized, then you might get priority placement to go into public housing, alongside all of the traditional kind of family planning programs, abortion, vasectomies, oral contraception, and so on. So it really was a very comprehensive push.
It worked.
And it worked, right? But of course, the funny thing about demography is that this process takes a long time to come about. So even though Korea's fertility rate dropped to below replacement nearly 40 years ago, and even though it has very low immigration, the population still continued to grow. So it's only really recently that we are starting to see this shift towards population stagnation into population decline and a growth towards a very old population. In those early stages of low fertility rates, actually, the first processes, the first stages of population aging are very good for an economy, because you've got more women going into work, you've got fewer children. It's what we call a demographic dividend, right? And this is what a lot of these kind of tiger economies and the East Asian miracle, a lot of emerging markets have this age structure where you've got lots of people in the middle, right? You have a large labor force because fewer children and the older people are not surviving to very older ages yet. So you have this kind of bubble in the middle, which if you can turn into productivity, really drives economic growth. And of course, in Korea, because of their enormous investment in health and education in the late 20th century and into the start of the 21st century, they were able to turbocharge that demographic dividend to really create this kind of economic miracle. But it doesn't last forever. And that is the situation where we are now.
Okay, so by the 2000s, when we'd got to this point, I think the fertility rate had dropped to 1.3, which is still higher than it is now. What was causing that? What kind of pressures were there on young people in South Korea around having children?
Well, I think what you've got is this huge economic boom, right? You have a huge investment in education. And so you want to get in the best education for a smaller number of children. And it's not just the financial cost of education, but the psychological cost, right? Of the burden of ensuring that your children have the best possible future. And then, of course, linked to that is things like housing, things like making the most of these new economic opportunities. But then also, of course, is the issue of gender and gender roles. I think one of the most interesting things about Korea in many ways is that, of course, the economy has transformed just spectacularly, right? It's nothing like it was 50 or 60 years ago. But gender roles and gender norms and other kind of cultural norms and expectations have proved much slower to change. And then, of course, that links into some of the other reasons why fertility dropped in the 2000s and continues to be very low today. So this is about the direct costs of childbearing, but particularly the indirect costs of childbearing. So the consequences of unequal care roles in a society without strong gender equality. And of course, what the consequences of that are for careers. And the motherhood penalty in Korea is extremely high, right? It's very significant.
So in 2005, the Korean government introduced a new act called the Framework Act on Low Birth Rate in an Aging Society. That was really trying to address some of these issues. What particular policies did it introduce?
Firstly, family policies existed before 2005, but it was the first time really that these family policies were kind of packaged together with a goal of addressing the low birth rate problem, right? So grants and child allowances, of housing benefits, of childcare services, of work-life balance support, of different kind of cash incentives, some from a national level, some on a kind of district level, whether it's for marriage or childbearing, and kind of coordinating this through a presidential committee on population issues. So in a sense, these are all fairly traditional, what you might call pronatalist policies. And a lot of money was spent on this, right? Hundreds of billions of US dollars were invested into this family policy kind of pro-natalist program from 2005.
Did it work?
Well, it couldn't have worked that well because we're talking about jumping to 0.8. I mean, I think some people, if they're very optimistic, and you hear this in Singapore a lot, which also invested a lot in pro-natalist policy, is that, well, without these policies, fertility would have dropped even lower, right? But of course, this is counterfactual. We don't really know that's the case. I mean, my argument is to say, okay, we're going to do all these different things to increase the fertility rate. Then if the fertility rate doesn't go up, or even worse, goes down, then it looks like all of these policies are a failure. But actually, of course, all of these policies, in many ways, made life better, right? They did make improvements. And when people say, oh, they've spent hundreds of billions of dollars on family policy, actually, the majority of this went on housing benefits. So if actually you say, well, did this make the housing situation better or less worse than it would have been? Then probably it did. Improving childcare, yes, it wasn't perfect. There are a lot of issues and a lot of challenges. But is it better to have more childcare than less childcare? Well, it's better to have more childcare, right? So if the government were to look at all of these other different aspects, these different outcomes of family policy, rather than just fertility rate, then actually there's not wasted money. But there again, we know that people don't have children purely because of a financial reason, right? There's a whole different set of things. And so Korea right now has got one of the longest parental leave allowances in the OECD, right? For maternal and paternal leave. But because the underlying work culture and gender roles at work and gender roles at home have not changed, then actually the uptake is relatively low, right? So you have a right, but you're not going to take that right because it's going to have a negative consequence on your work. And in fact, there was a study 3 or 4 years ago which said that men who took longer paternity leave in Korea, at the end of it, actually wanted fewer children because they were like, well, I don't like it, right? This is hard work. This is difficult. And I should be working harder to support my family and not being at home, right? So unless you change these underlying structural issues around gender roles, around work culture and so on, then even well-meaning policies are not necessarily going to have the impact that they should.
Coming up, why is South Korea's fertility rate now slowly rising? And is that even a useful number to focus on? That's after this short break.
I was saved by God to make America great again.
An autocrat loves a crisis. A crisis is the way that they mobilize their base.
While America is under invasion from within, we're under invasion from within.
He's testing the boundaries of what he can get away with.
We should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military.
We've asked 6 of the world's preeminent scholars how we can measure the make of an autocrat. It's a recipe of sorts, tried and tested by the most infamous leaders in history.
Hugo Chavez in Venezuela.
Vladimir Putin in Russia.
Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler.
Viktor Orban in Hungary.
He's basically bulletproof in terms of criminal prosecution.
Join us from December 29 as we explore Trump, the making of an autocrat, from The Conversation.
Okay, so by 2024, then President Yoon Suk Yeol declared a national emergency over the birth rate. Incidentally, he's just been sentenced to life in prison, something we're not going to go into in this episode. Mm-hmm. But then South Korea's birth rate did actually start to go up. So it went up for the first time in 2024. And now with the 2025 data, we know it's gone up for 2 consecutive years. Do we know why that is? How do we try and understand what's happened?
There is a slightly geeky demography answer to this, which is that if you're just measuring the number of babies which are born, then 2 factors shape this. The first one is obviously how many babies that the average women actually have, but then there's also how many women of reproductive age there are. And back in the early 1990s, there was a bit of a baby boom. So there was a relatively big cohort of women being born in the early 1990s. So these women are now in their early to mid 30s, which in South Korea is a kind of prime childbearing age. So that group there are going to be having more children. Right?
The echo boomers.
Exactly. And this is why when you have a baby boom, like, for example, after the war, you're going to have this echo 20 or 30 years later, and then another echo of that kind of group there. So we don't know how long this echo might last and what the real significance of that is. And we won't know that for a few years yet. The second thing is, I think collectively, I feel like we've decided to stop talking about COVID, right? We're done with that now. But it would have upset a lot of people's life plans, a lot of impact on people's jobs. This is going to have an impact on marriage and the timing and choice of marriage.
And marriage is important, isn't it, in South Korea?
Marriage is 100% important. Childbearing outside of marriage is extremely rare. Marriage is not something that always just happens like that, right? Getting sorted out and engaged and organised in marriage can take quite a bit of time. So I think there is still perhaps some echo impact of COVID. But then, of course, there are all these policies as well. And we see some surveys that there are some slight increases in the willingness to have children, the willingness to get married. But is Korea not sexist anymore? Right? Does work-life balance, is it now great in Korea? Is fragile labour and fragile work in Korea, has that stopped, right? Is everybody going to get a great pension? Is housing got cheaper? Are people not really worried about education and over-education anymore? Well, no, right? None of those underlying structural things have really changed. And in some ways, it's gone backwards, right? We've seen the kind of anti-feminist backlash in recent years.
Is it also just really difficult to say, well, this policy led to this effect and that policy led to that effect when you've got so much going on? And that must be just a really difficult part of a demographer's job.
That's what makes it so exciting, right? What makes it so difficult. Because, so in some ways, you can have a migration policy. It's okay, we're going to change migration policy to enable this group of people to come. And then if this group of people come, then you can say, well, that's because of the policy, right? But with fertility, there's so many different factors. And of course, in a postmodern world, everybody wants different things, right? Everybody has different expectations. Everybody's plans, hopes, dreams, aspirations, how they think they're going to reconcile work and family. All of these things are going to be different by individuals, right? So we don't really know the direct impact of policies on childbearing. But, and this is, I think, the big mistake that is often made when we talk about family planning, is that I think there's a view that said, well, look, in the past, the government did all these different things and the fertility rate went down. So now, if the government does all these other things, then the fertility rate should go up again. But that forgets completely that all of these things which happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s happened at the same time as, an economic boom of investment in health, investment in education, of urbanization, of a transformation of society. The family planning program is only part of that. And in the same way as today, the family policy program to change the fertility rate is only one part of the context in which people in Korea or anywhere else in the world are having children.
So, Stuart, birth rates can only tell us part of the story about what's happening in a country and its population. The new data shows that there was a 6.8% rise in birth rates, but there was also a 1.3% rise in death rates. And overall, the population shrunk for the 6th consecutive year. So what does South Korea's death rates tell us?
The reason why the death rate increases is because there are more older people. This is a very typical thing that you see in older populations, because older people are more at risk of dying, and therefore you have natural population decline. But of course, that masks the fact that the death rate in South Korea is extremely low, right? And life expectancy in South Korea is extremely high, which is another kind of revolution which has occurred over the last 50 or 60 years or so. And of course, this is always presented in a very negative way, right? That this is some kind of existential crisis. But of course, this is the ultimate human achievement, right? That we've actually got this situation in terms of people are not dying very much, right? Where they're living very long lives and have a high life expectancy. So, an aging population certainly brings a lot of challenges, but it also brings different economic opportunities, and we just have to adapt to it. This is just the reality, right? We're having a smaller, older, but more highly educated, highly skilled, healthy population. Now, another component, though, which is that there is no positive angle to this at all, is about suicide. South Korea has one of the highest suicide rate in the OECD, both among younger people and among older people. And to put this into perspective, so, in 2024, there were like 240,000 births in South Korea, but there were also 14,000 suicides, right? So this is like 5%.
Do we know why it's so high in South Korea particularly?
A variety of different issues, but a lot around high pressure, working hours, work culture, but also the fragility of work. For younger people, there's an enormous amount of pressure in terms of education and in terms of getting the right job. And it's very, very difficult when you're in the job to actually keep the job. And if you're not in the job, it's kind of like existential crisis, right? Like you've put all this time and effort and energy into your education, and is it really paying off? But then also at older ages, we see it's very common for particularly older men in their 50s and 60s. Over the recent decades, they will lose their jobs because they're expensive. It's cheaper to hire younger workers. And then, of course, in a cultural system or a society where it's that older man in a patriarchal system, you have this role to give, to lead the family. And if your work is a big part of your identity, and if all of that goes, then again, it's another kind of existential crisis. Whether it's very low fertility rates or high suicide rates, these are a reflection of big issues in society, like downstream consequences of these institutions, which just don't seem to be working with what people want or even need.
Do you think this all means, in your view, that when we talk about population shrinking, population aging, there is perhaps an over-concentration on birth rates, whether that's in South Korea, whether it's in Hong Kong, whether it's in Europe or elsewhere, that people put too much of their effort, policy-wise, on birth rates, on fertility rates, and actually there's a bigger picture to tell?
Yeah, exactly. Even just the way that we talk about childbearing and family policy, it's always seems it's about numbers. It's about people as a means to an end. It's this very utilitarian way of looking at it, right? But it's viewing people as units of production, right? How can we have more, better workers who are going to pay more tax? And of course, nobody has children for the state. Certainly no one has children to fix the pension system, right? Or to improve tax receipts or productivity, right?
Oh, yeah, that's exactly what I thought when I had a kid. Yeah. Oh, it'll help my future pension.
Yeah, exactly. Hooray. No, not even your pension, right? It's about the pension.
Other people's pensions.
Other people's pensions in 20 years' time. And of course, what is the labour market going to look like in 20 years' time? It's going to be very different to today.
Yeah.
So instead of focusing on numbers and babies as a means to an end, of course, what I think it's better to do is to say, well, look, I think there is a crisis in fertility, but it's not that people are not having enough children. It's that people somehow are just not able to live the life which involves work and family that they actually feel that they would like to do. That, in social theory, we talk about not being able to write your own biography, right? Being able to have the life that you think you want to do. And I think that's really a sad thing, right? And that is a crisis. Yeah. We shouldn't say, well, then family policy and all of these different things are a bad thing because they're trying to increase the fertility rate. We should actually say there is a role for all of these things, but it's about supporting people to meet their aspirations, to allow them to live the kind of lives that they want with the family that they want. And that also includes respecting people who say, well, I don't want to have kids.
South Korea is often pointed to as a warning sign by the parts of the world which are worried about their shrinking population. Everyone looks at their data. It's big news in a way that it isn't for other countries when their fertility rates gets released. And it's also sometimes used to push pretty aggressive pro-natalist narratives, frankly, sometimes eugenicist ones, racist ones. But what do you really think that other countries who are worried about their population should take from South Korea's experience in recent years?
And you're absolutely right that a lot of places, even places like Indonesia, where fertility is higher than 2. Even in Laos or Cambodia, where you've got relatively high fertility rate, yes, they're going to look at South Korea and go, is that where we want it? And when you see your fertility rate dropping like a stone, then there is a point of like, well, where is it going to end? Right? It is entirely possible that other countries in the world could go into that category. Mainland China has dropped down to 1. We're starting to see very low fertility rates where we wouldn't necessarily expect them, like in Bhutan, like in parts of India, in parts of Nepal, in Thailand, now in Latin America. So we are seeing this kind of drop. But I think it is important that South Korea is a little bit different, is a little bit special in its own way for various reasons. Firstly, what we call compressed modernity, right? These tremendous changes happened in a very, very short period of time. The second issue, I think, is about the nature of the state and a history of, very top-down anti-natalist planning, which then had to be switched backwards. But for me, I think one of the biggest differences is that, Korea, particularly before 1997, but still since then, it's got this idea of what we call a developmentalist welfare state, right? Basically geared towards economic production. We are only going to invest in health and education, primarily, right? In order to get workers to be as efficient, as effective as possible, and to have fewer children, so we get women into the labour market, so we can really make the economy grow. And in a sense, that worked very, very well. But then all questions about a broader social safety net, work-life balance, gender roles, everything like that, which other countries around the world today, I think, are much more sensitized to, this is not really given enough consideration. So when you put all of these things together, I think that, Korea is a bit different, is a bit of an outlier. And I think it's certainly not automatic that places now with very rapidly falling fertility rates like Thailand, like Uruguay, like Costa Rica, like Vietnam are going to become like Korea.
Well, thank you so much, Stuart. It's been fascinating talking with you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. This episode was written and produced by me, Gemma Ware, and Katie Flood. Sound mixing is by Eleanor Brezzi, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with as many people as possible. If you like what we do, please consider supporting us at donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. And please do also rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. Thanks for listening.
Hiya, I'm Katie Edwards, and I'm a health editor at The Conversation.
I'm Dan Baumgart. I'm a lecturer in health and life sciences at the University of Bristol, where I also work as a GP.
And we work together a lot, and we try to explain weird and wonderful things about the body. And now we're teaming up to host Strange Health, which is a new video podcast from The Conversation.
So each episode, we're going to be taking a health trend going viral on social media.
You know the kind of thing. Drink chlorophyll to make sure you don't stink.
Do you really need to detox in January?
Have a supplement to make your bum look better. All that kind of thing. Each week, it's going to be me and Dan, plus an expert, who are going to thrash out between the truths and the myths.
Me being an anatomist, I was like, can I have a look? And it was huge.
The liver is amazing. It's probably the only organ that can regenerate itself completely.
And we're calling it Strange Health because we're not scared of disgusting things. Episode 1 arrives on the 20th of January. So follow us on YouTube or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.